So, good afternoon. Dear President Gurjash and Roland Jacob, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you first of all for having me at this interesting Science, Faith and Religion Summit in Budapest. As you can see from the title, my talk will be about consciousness and artificial consciousness and things related to that. Let me have a start with something different, not too different as you will see, but still, with Thomas Aquinas. In his treatise on evil, De Malo, in question 16, Thomas Aquinas discusses devils or demons, always interesting of course, their nature and their powers. In Article 11 of that question, which discusses the question whether devils can affect the soul's cognitive powers, he asked the question whether devils can make people see things that are not there, as if it were. And his answer there is double. He says, well, it depends on what you mean by things that are new or not new. And as an example of things that a devil cannot make someone see, though new but still cannot do that, is something, and examples he gives are someone who is born blind to imagine colors, or a person who is born deaf to imagine sounds. Now, it is not a coincidence, I think, that Thomas chooses to illustrate these examples to illustrate that devils cannot do what the devils cannot do in presenting new stuff to human beings. Incidentally, spoiler alert for the connoisseurs among you, the word here, but it will come back later, is the concept of qualia. Now, incidentally, when it comes to powers of presentation, angels are not better off than devils. Because in the Summa Theologiae, in first part, question 111, on the action of angels, Thomas asked whether it is at all possible for angels to make people see things, imagine things that are not there. And then he gives an example, what angels can do or not do. He says, an angel can change or changes the imagination, not indeed by the impression of an imaginative form, in no way previously received from the senses, for he cannot make a man born blind imagine colors. The same example as with devils. And it is exactly these two things that will be relevant later on in the talk, since again, this is related to the concept of consciousness in a certain way, as you will see, and more specifically, that famous concept of qualia. Now, let me say first a few words about consciousness. We all know that the concept of consciousness is notoriously hard to define. In this talk, I will follow a definition more or less as it is used in contemporary philosophy of mind by such philosophers as David Chalmers and John Searle. The definition, I think, I will use, highlights the most important properties of the thing we call consciousness in general. And just a few elements here. Chalmers says, consciousness and sentience, as I understand them, are subjective experiences. Consciousness, continues, has many different dimensions: sensory experience, affective experience, cognitive experience, and so on. Searle adds in the same vein the following: what is consciousness? It consists, says Searle, of inner qualitative qualities, that's important, subjective unified state of sentience, awareness, thoughts, and feelings actually. And it is these qualitative, subjective elements that will become later important. One might add here, with respect to what consciousness then is, that some things like a unified element in consciousness, and especially also intentionality, as it is called, conscious states, at least many conscious states, are about things in the world, or in a world, let's say. So, okay, let's assume that's a definition we can work with. Now, both, if you have noticed, both Chalmers and Searle in these definitions stress the subjective and qualitative aspect of consciousness. The presence of what are nowadays called qualia, thusnesses. Come back to that later, but a lot of the discussion nowadays with respect to philosophical discussions on consciousness turns around such questions as, what is consciousness? How can it be modeled? Where does it come from? And to what extent is it caused, that's an important question, by brain processes that are themselves not conscious? There are lots of other questions that I will not mention, but that are also present. It is interesting to add here that also in the field of artificial intelligence, there is an important and developing field of interest. In this respect, the possibility is considered of the construction or implementation of conscious states in computers. Yeah? We might think here even, there was a lot of discussion at Google's Lambda some time ago. Computers, the question will be, or could be, can computers ever be or become conscious? The field that is being developed is then for also called artificial consciousness or machine consciousness for short. So far so good. Now, when it comes to the explanation of consciousness, there are many theories, and I mentioned just a few. Dualist, physicalist, functionalist, and many more. Information integration theory, they are all framed in a general philosophical framework that's nowadays called the mind-body problem. I will not go into the mind-body problem in itself, but let me note here that within the theories that are being discussed nowadays, it is especially materialist or also called physicalist theories that can be called the preferred theories of much of contemporary research inspired by the neurosciences, and also you find the same in the field of artificial intelligence. They are inspired by these physicalist, materialist approaches. Now, it is a fact, I think, that there are two related problems that are important here, from which these theories suffer. And there is one, they all have to do with the elements, the intrinsic nature of what consciousness and conscious experience is. First of all, I already noted that consciousness, many conscious states, let's put it like that, have a qualitative character. Yeah? This is about conscious experience. Sometimes they're also called raw feelings, raw feels, they're sometimes called like feeling pain, seeing red, the taste of a good Belgian Trappist, or the pan on halma is not bad either, the smell of a ripe tomato, and so on. These experiences, these conscious experiences are called phenomenal experiences. And the term that is being used here to indicate these specific kinds of experiences is, as already mentioned, qualia. Qualia, Latin term, doesnesses. These qualia are intrinsic private properties of a large number of conscious experiences. The idea that is behind this is the way, what it is like, how it feels, these things. And by extension, I would want to add, the idea itself of consciousness belongs there. There is something it is like to be conscious, rather than not conscious. So consciousness as a phenomenon itself is a quale. That's interesting to note for future investigation, really. Now, our grasp of what it is like to undergo these phenomenal qualitative states is supplied to us by introspection, first and foremost. We have, and that's the thing, an admittedly incomplete grasp of what goes on objectively in the brain and the body when we have these experiences. It seems, there is a gap between these two things. For one thing, it is very hard to see how, in our understanding, the two fields, as if it were, can be bridged. What we see in the brain is firing of neurons. Yeah? Now, no matter how much, in fact, information we get from these firings, it does not seem that from these firings, the whole qualitative subjective experience emerges. We have no theories, in fact, or rather no good theories of this phenomenon. Yeah? This first problem is called the explanatory gap. The hard problem of consciousness is a little bit different, is the problem of explaining why any physical state is conscious rather than non-conscious. So again, the explanatory gap is the how question. The hard problem is the why question with respect to consciousness. And they are both serious problems, as we will see. Let me put it differently a little bit. Physical explanation is ultimately entirely cast in terms of microphysical structure and dynamics. But in the case of consciousness, structure and dynamics does not seem enough. That is not all that needs explaining. We also need to explain why macroscopic structure and dynamics is accompanied by consciousness. It doesn't immediately follow as if it were. So, these two problems are serious problems for any scientific explanation also of consciousness. With this, and I want to add some that is well known, in fact, these two problems, the explanatory gap, and these problems are known. I want to add a third thing, and that is also more or less known, but we can do something with it, I think. There is a distinction when we study these mental phenomena between the first and the third person perspective. What does this mean? Well, roughly, the third person's perspective is the perspective in our attempt to explain consciousness that we find in science, the reductive explanations in science. So, third person, objective. No, sometimes it's called the view from nowhere, because it's objective. It's not related to the subject, but anyway. So, there is that framework, or rather there's these two frameworks, because the first person is different, because there the data we get from the first person perspective are exactly what I mentioned, namely introspection, subjective experience, qualia, and as you can already see, the explanation in the third person and the explanation in the first person seem to be not easily reconcilable, to say the least. Okay. So let us therefore now go a little bit further and see how this distinction, to which I also will come back, relates to artificial consciousness, really. In the field of artificial consciousness, there are several options that one might want to take if it comes to an attempt to implement consciousness in machines. I mentioned just a few. One might try and construct machines that have the same external behavior as conscious systems. Some kind of, by way of a behavioral criterion. A second approach could be constructing models of the correlates of consciousness. The famous models of correlates, as you can find in the neurosciences, really. And the third one I want to mention here, that is the holy grail, in fact, of this whole enterprise, is to construct machines that are phenomenally conscious. Again, when humans are conscious, they are immersed in a world of colors, smells, sounds, feelings. These are not properties of the physical world. They are constituents of conscious experience. A machine that would be immersed in a world of colors, smells, and sounds would be such a kind of machine. And it would definitely have very many advantages vis-à-vis other machines. For one thing, several elements here, such machines would have a much larger autonomy, a certain degree of freedom, since vis-à-vis machines that are pre-programmed. Such machines could be autonomous, self-representing. They could move around in environments in a more easy way, and could therefore also react more adequately to unforeseen circumstances. And finally, if that would at all be possible, we would get more insight in what it means for a human to have consciousness or to be conscious. So, from what I already mentioned with respect to qualia and the hard problem of consciousness, this might definitely be a problem. Typically, come back for a second to Thomas, these qualia he mentioned, I will call them qualia now for the sake of the argument, are known also in the literature nowadays, contemporary literature. I just mentioned Frank Jackson in his knowledge argument, Thomas Nagel in his famous What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Indeed, in order for a devil or an angel to present a human being with such new kind of experience, it would be required that there be a duplication, not just a simulation of a duplication that should be offered to these humans in order for them to really feel them. Now, according to Thomas, for reasons that are a bit different from nowadays discussions, that is not possible at all. No? So, And maybe I should mention here, for another example Thomas gives, is that it is possible for an angel or a devil to make someone, a person, imagine golden mountains. Because he says, well, we have the concept of gold, we have the concept of mountain, and we can combine them, the devil can combine it too, and then make you believe you see a mountain. So, now the problems I mentioned also relate to discussions on artificial consciousness. Why is that? Well, in two ways, actually. First of all, I think there is a problem with AIs, artificial intelligence's inherent computationalism, and secondly, the idea of the first and third person point of view, which is the most important one. For the computationalist idea, just mention this, that it is hard to see how a computation, an algorithm, right, would ever be able to produce this subjective element at all. There is nothing in an algorithm that presents the subjective element in that sense. More important also, maybe, is the fact that we are dealing now, when we want to explain everything, with the difference between first and third person. Now, let me go into that a little bit. What are these perspectives? I already mentioned them. The first person is the perspective of the immediate impressions that we have and the description of them by introspection. The other one, third person, is the description by means of, let's say, science in general, the objective point of view of science. Correlates, looking for correlates, writing programs to implement consciousness. Now, in this respect, it is held that a scientifically explaining or reducing consciousness would then be to find a procedure which would allow the qualitative experience, which are private and so on, to reduce them to the quantitative objective perspective, so the third person perspective. And that works well when we look at, for instance, say, water, right? Pure physical identities seem to be present, no problem. Consider water. Water is H2O. In order for us to see what the properties of water in general are, say, for instance, transparency, liquidity, it is sufficient to look at the composition, the molecular composition of the stuff, and from that, if all goes well, from the micro properties or micro descriptions of the stuff, we can explain why the stuff in question is liquid, transparent, and so on. And this does not seem to work from the point of view of the third person perspective with respect to consciousness. What do we get when we look at consciousness from the third person's point of view? We get, to put it in one word, universal zombiehood. We are all zombies because in the gray matter of the brain, there is the lighting up of neurons that does not present us with a technicolor world of feeling, subjectivity, and so on. So there is obviously a problem. Now, how are we going to solve it or try to solve it? First of all, we should consider the idea that when we talk about first and third person point of view, we are dealing with two specific different perspectives of looking at the phenomenon. Now, let's say they are expressed, these perspectives are expressed in language or in theory, you might say. Now, every theory is what philosophers call an ontology. It's essential for a theory. And what is an ontology is that the set of things that a theory deems there to be present in reality, so to speak, if that theory is to work at all. So, just one thing, it is clear, but I come back to it, that these are very different in the case for the first and the third person perspective. Already in the 20th century, American philosopher, Rudolf Carnap, introduced a distinction, when he was talking about ontology, between internal and external questions in ontology. Carnap believed that it makes sense only to talk about what exists in the framework of a conceptual linguistic framework. So within the framework, it can be said that things exist. When you talk about, or when you want to ask the question, now, but next to every possible framework, do the things in question exist? He says that is a nonsense question. It's not a non-cognitive question. The example he gives is not in philosophy of mind, but on numbers. Numbers do exist within theories about numbers. But when we ask, do numbers really exist? Unless you're a Platonist, but that's okay, it's no harm done there, but in principle, it is not a good question, right? Because it's an external question. So let us try and apply this to this problem with the explanatory gap in philosophy of mind. So, when we look at, in general, when we look at something, we can indeed construct several phenomena on that thing, several theories on that thing, knowing that it is about the same object, but we can look at it from different perspectives. Think of a violin. You can both hear and look at the violin. You know, of course, that it's the same violin, but there is no direct relation between the violin as an object and the music that is produced. Now, we know that it's about the same thing. Now, if we apply this to the study of consciousness and the first and third person perspective, then within the framework of the third person perspective, we are explaining consciousness, and what we're not trying to do there is how miraculously the brain transforms into the phenomena, into the technical experience of consciousness. No, it doesn't. The brain doesn't. That is not what is the idea. The idea is different, really. What is being done in this perspective is to show how one and the same phenomenon appears on the one hand as the activation of neurons, and on the other hand also as consciousness with subjective experiences. From the third person perspective point of view, we talk about the conversion of external stimuli, electromagnetic waves, in some kind of a neuronal code in the neural structure of the brain. From the framework of the first person perspective, there is no such conversion because it's directly given. Conclusion: there is an asymmetry between these two perspectives, really. And therefore, it is to be expected that there is a phenomenal difference between the two. So, that means that in this respect, the explanatory gap, in a sense, disappears. However, not the hard problem of consciousness. We can, of course, ask questions about the existence of a mechanism which transforms the first person into the third person. But what would that mean? In the way Carnap would look at it, that would mean that there is another perspective which would allow us to transform the one into the other. But there is no other perspective, at least not in principle, which would allow to do that. It would be a new perspective then. And that is, of course, a problem. Now, then, does consciousness then really exist or not? Well, it's like Schrödinger's cat, life and death. So there is a paradox, you might say. And what to do with it? I'm almost done. The attempt to turn consciousness inside out, and I mean by this objectifying it through the third person perspective, puts us in a position which ends up in what I call universal zombiehood. Answering the dilemma what we put is something that allows for several possibilities. What should we do? Well, there are several things, and that's maybe good for the discussion, that one might do here. We could say that it's not bad at all, there's no problem, we will solve the problem in a century or two. Not going to work because there are two different perspectives. So what we would need then is a theory with an overarching theory. And we know from physics that we have the same problems. Look at relativistic physics and quantum theory. There is no overarching theory for the two. And the same could be the case here. That means, of course, that our physics is incomplete, and therefore the knowledge on consciousness that we have is also incomplete. And we'll have to see whether that is at all a principal possibility. A second thing, with respect to consciousness and the explanation of consciousness, there are too many theories, too many contradicting theories that explain that phenomenon. Sometimes people say that this shows that the science is immature. If you have too many conflicting theories on a field, that's a big problem. Other thing we can do, and I use Thomas Aquinas on purpose, is to say, well, let's do away with all of this, and let's follow theories which, for instance, would not take into account the idea of an explanatory gap. Dennett's theory is one of them, or Aquinas' theory is also one of them, for the very simple reasons that for Thomas, there is no possibility of reducing the one to the other. He considers three possibilities of the living matter: vegetative, animal, sensory. And there is, between these three, there is no reduction possible. We share with animals the sensory thing, and that there is where qualia belongs. So it is no way, he says, that it, well, he doesn't say it, of course, I think he implies it, that we can reduce that element, that the subjective, the consciousness idea, to, let's say, a lower level, say, the inanimate nature. Almost done. Another possibility would be to follow Wilfrid Sellars, famous American philosopher who already in the 60s of the 20th century made a distinction between the two kinds of image that man has: a manifest image and scientific image. So the scientific image is the one that that's the third person perspective. In fact, the manifest image is the first person in the person's perspective. However, he seems to, at least, not 100% certain, Sellars seems to believe that the one can be reduced to the other, but not completely, he says. Especially with respect to the normative, there is no possibility. And finally, maybe good for the discussion, I think that we can make an attempt at some kind of a solution through what I call a version of Gödel's incompleteness theorems, but not in the way, for instance, that Roger Penrose uses theory. Especially with respect to that property I mentioned in the beginning of intentionality in consciousness. How that is done, maybe we can discuss that briefly during the discussion. Thank you.